Exactly.
All right, it's recording.
Go ahead.
I want you to
Start? All right. Thank you very much for letting us join you today. Really appreciate the chance to be here and talk about what we do on the privacy and security side of the law. My name is Dino Tsibouris, and I'm an Ohio native for the most part. Grew up in Columbus, a loyal Buckeye fan. Worked in-house for a number of years for Bank One Corporation, doing exactly that, which is now JP Chase, and then started my own firm about 10 years ago. I work pretty much, I have a kind of a boutique practice, right? We focus specifically on privacy and technology and security. That's all we do. Mehmet Munar has been with me for several years before. Recently worked for IBM for a couple of years, and then recently rejoined our firm as a partner. And he and I have had the privilege of working together for a number of years on these issues, and you may have seen us at presentations for the past couple of years. So I appreciate the chance to be here. As we go through a lot of this, I'd like to welcome questions from you. Can't promise we'll have answers for you on the spot, and of course none of this is legal advice, right? This is just news. But that being said, that we want this to be information that's useful to you, so feel free to ask questions as we go along. Mehmet, how about yourself?
Right. Once again, thanks for having us. And if you'd like, I'll walk you through the outline of what we're going to be talking about mainly. We're going to talk a little bit about the data breaches in 2014 and 2015, just because it gives us a sense of the themes and trends in data breaches. Then talk a little about this possible federal data breach notification law, expanding state breach notification laws, contracting for security in the cloud, and finally talk about addressing security breaches in the cloud. So with that, let's move on to some goons. Tunes. So, you have a data breach every so often, you wish you could send goons, but then they end up coming to the wrong person because you have to work on the breach to make sure. Anyhow, themes and trends, 2014 and 2015. This is kind of a bold slide in that there's a lot to talk about here, but a few themes are that you're seeing a lot more foreign state actors in data breaches, right? I'm sure you've all heard about Deep Panda and its possible involvement in the latest OPM breach, also possibly in Anthem. There's also multi-factor authentication. That's always been around, and it's always gotten a lot of talk, but there's more and more of it lately, because specifically the OPM breach, they weren't using multi-factor authentication. In JP Chase, the server that was breached was one of the few, if not the only server that didn't have multi-factor authentication. So the chances are that, had it been used, some of this may have been prevented. Another theme that you see is the effect on corporate management, or managements altogether. You'll recall the Target CIO resigned. Shortly thereafter, Target CEO resigned. The CEO had been with the company 35 years. Given there are other financial issues that's been affecting Target, like having to close hundreds of stores in Canada, that probably affected that financial issue and the CEO resigning. But more and more, security is becoming a board-level issue, and people are paying attention to it, and if they don't, they're getting fired from it. I'm sure you've all heard that the director of OPM, Catherine Archuleta, resigned recently, and the Senate has been asking for the CIO of OPM to resign as well, so we'll see how that goes. But once again, board-level issue. And then another issue is vendor management. I could point to Target simply because I'm sure you read that the Target breach happened as a result of their HVAC vendor entering the billing system being compromised and then made their way into Target systems.
Yeah, on a side note, do any of you ever go and read the forensic details on these large breaches to see how they happen? They're an interesting story, aren't they? I mean, I'm a lawyer and I deal with the policy. What does the law require? One of the biggest challenges we face is that a lot of the laws kind of look in the rearview mirror. What happened? Is it bad? Should we sue you? They're not necessarily prescriptive saying, here's what thou shalt do. And so the idea is, when does your security become so poor that it becomes an issue where it's an unfair trade practice, right? Or is it deceptive because you say you'll keep it secure in your policies, but then you don't actually do it? You have a situation like Wyndham, and forgive me if I step on anybody's toes because you were formerly with Wyndham or any of these other companies, but the idea that you have a compromised server that isn't inventory that you can't even find, You know, the idea that you don't have updates of using software that is so old that you can't actually update it, but you're using it to store card data for your as a service provider for your franchisees. Or with Target, right? They're using Ariba Castanet, or they're using Ariba AP software, and then you have a user that's doing AP, submitting invoices. Their credentials get breached, they get in, and the invoice system is actually attached and not segregated from the customer system, which can then be used to project code into the card readers and intercept that at the retail level. These are fascinating forensic situations. It's all come back to the importance of good information security practices, which are people creating good policies, people making sure that the systems are configured well, and making sure that people who are using them are educated in how to maintain a secure use of their tokens or their passwords. They're fascinating reads, just fascinating stuff.
Right. And one of the main reasons why I wanted to include Wyndham was the consequences. What happens when you have a breach? Well, you're going to have an enforcement action. Chances are it affects so many people and you fail miserably at what you're doing, and you're a private entity that is subject to the Federal Trade Commission's jurisdiction. They are going to come after you with an enforcement action. What happened in Wyndham's case is they decided to fight the FTC. They took them to court and they lost. And right now that case has gone up to the appeals court, and the appeals court is hearing it to see, does the Federal Trade Commission have the jurisdiction to enforce security obligations on these entities without necessarily passing regulations. The FTC doesn't have regulations that applies to everybody under the...
Yeah, pause and analyze that for a second. There's two claims in the Wyndham case. One is that, you know, FTC, you said in congressional testimony several years ago that you did not have the authority to pursue a data security standard. That was one claim. You said you didn't have the authority. And then the second was, if you did have the authority, you haven't given us any prescriptive guidelines as to what is to be required of us for information security so that we can comply with the law. And in the trial court case, court's like, no, just because he said that in congressional testimony doesn't mean they didn't have the authority to find another way to get you. And just because they didn't tell you, here's what you have to do as a baseline, give you a prescriptive step of here's what you have to do, right? Then that's not an impediment for them suing you and then entering into a settlement agreement in exchange for payment of a fee and what looks a lot like ISO-ish type standards. I mean, if you think about that, it's not like the FTC doesn't have an idea of what a baseline should be, because they have a history of settlements, right? You can look at settlements and say, okay, 10 to 20 years of audits, you have to have a dedicated CIO, you have to have a plan, things like that. So it's not like they don't have, but there's no prescriptive guidance that you can do, that you can look at to protect yourself.
Right. Yeah, with that, I said I was going to touch on the issue of management being affected, and so that's what I'm doing with this slide. We sometimes wish every single time we're dealing with a data breach that we could launch the escape pod with our golden parachute.
At least he's got the money.
At least he's got the money. Well, anyhow, the legal response is been getting more and more complex. Congress is hearing this, and they're proposing federal legislation on data breach notification. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. But states are not standing still. The states have been passing data breach notification legislation for over a decade. And the legislation is changing such that the type of data that comes under the legislation is increasing. The definition of personal data is increasing. And the triggers are expanding. And you end up with civil liability. Inevitably, you may be hit with a class action lawsuits. That's what happened to Sony in their class action lawsuit over the PlayStation breach. And they paid over $100 million. I want to say Target dedicated something along the lines of $240 million to all their legal fees and everything else that they have to pay for the card services. And the regulators are not standing still. They are catching up to the times. The FTC just recently unveiled in the beginning of this month a new security initiative, where they're going from city to city, talking more about the security obligations of businesses. And they've had an Office of Technology and Research and Innovation. At first, it was just about mobile, because it was just a new area, but now that area is expanding exponentially. Smart homes, connected automobiles. So as we start using technology more and more, not just on our cell phones, but also all these other devices that we're using, Federal Trade Commission happens to be the prime regulator that is going after those companies that they feel are not fulfilling their privacy promises and security promises to consumers. And even though the FTC has been litigating the Wyndham case with Wyndham for the last year and a half almost, that hasn't slowed them down one bit. If anything, they're just expanding their security enforcement. Anything you want to add there?
Yeah, anybody know who she is? It's a bonus question. This gives you extra credit. You can use that for the test at the end of this weekend.
Just resigned, that's her.
Oh no, that's not a good step. That's not the OPM lady. This is Kamala Harris, who Obama commented so positively about that Michelle made him walk it back a little bit. She's the Attorney General for the state of California, and she is aggressive on privacy enforcement. Now, don't just think federal, right? Privacy is a state issue as well. So when you get sued for privacy violations, it can include not just the feds, but there can also be state claims too. What she has done is she has really aggressively tried to create privacy codes that the industry can adopt and create their own level of baseline. So she works, for example, a lot of mobile, works with, think how many technology companies that do data mining, predictive analytics, things like that are based in California. She takes their unfair trade laws and applies them to privacy and security. And unlike a lot of states, she's tried to work with industry to create some guidelines that they can voluntarily work with so that she's not just shooting from the hip and suing random. Now, she's a state attorney general, so we call them what? The AG. We also call those almost governor, because if they get a chance to make a good public impact, right, then they can run. They've got name recognition, which is exactly what she'd like to do. She is, I think what we would call that collaborative state government. The idea of working with industry, saying something's got to be done, but let's work this together so that you know what's expected of you. It'd be nice to get that from the FTC, but some states are taking that pace. And California takes the approach that if you do something that breaks our law with one of our residents, then you have violated our law and we can come after you regardless of what state that came from, be it Ohio, be it Massachusetts, be it New York. So you have to be careful about extraterritorial application of state law. So every privacy statement we draft, make sure that it's California compliant, that it's got the California statement in there if they've got California customers. Don't forget Massachusetts, and by now it's old news, but Massachusetts has a state law data standard that you have to consider as well. You may see these pop up time and time again as states say, let's add state claims, because the FTC can't do anything. They can't do everything, right? There's only so much they can do, so they got the big fish. Well, states can go after the ones in their own backyard as well, so I think you're going to see more and more state security regulations coming up. Yes?
Do you think those federal regulations are going to be to supersede the state laws?
That's a great question. We're going to talk about that specifically in our next session, and there's a lot of pressure over that exact issue, because the states, especially AGs, don't want to give up that control.
Right, exactly. And that brings us to the next slide. If you like,
Perfect time, right on cue.
We'll treat this as a primer on state data breach notification laws, because the federal law that's been proposed at the beginning of the year kind of mimics those state laws. And this was initially proposed by Obama in his State of the Union address, and sadly there hasn't been much movement on this at all. Some businesses who have to comply with these 47 different state breach notification laws would love to have one federal statute to comply with. And the way it's written right now is it would preempt state laws. So if it contradicts what federal law says, you don't have to abide by it, you just have to abide by the federal law. And the notification time is a 30-day time period. No private right of action. What that means is you don't get to sue Target because they had a breach.
And this is huge. These two things are enormous. Now, my practice started, I got out of law school in '93, clerked for in-house, doing multi-state survey research for what's the maximum late charge, what's the maximum things you can charge in a credit agreement. So I really understood the interrelation between federal and state laws and how they work together. The normal way that federal regulation works is one of two ways. Either federal law preempts it and states can't regulate it, which is for important industries, right, like telephones maybe, or things like that, or where the scheme has to be so pervasive because the national economy is implicated. But for consumer protection, the normal way that the United States government has done consumer protection is federal law is a baseline. It's a starting point, and states are allowed to add to that. So you get a loan agreement, you'll see if you live in California, this notice. If you live in Nevada, this notice, and the mouse print in the back. If you're progressive in your politics, you love the idea of the federal government having its role protecting you and states having local flexibility to do that. But when you think about the tech giants involved in lobbying privacy, they're looking at it from a, how can we do this cheaply? They would much rather have one federal law to rule them all. And so they would like to, unlike in every other situation, They want to cap that and say this is the baseline and preempt state law so that they have a level playing field with the idea of let's save money. It will cost jobs. When you get to the idea of private right of action, almost every privacy statute specifically says only the government can sue you, right? HHS, Office of Civil Rights, Federal Trade Commission. There might be some state statutes that give the state AG, but the idea of a person suing for the violation of their privacy rights, although you may get settlement letters in the mail, although you might get notices that say if you sign here you can get a refund or something or whatever, if you actually read those, you don't get squat, right? It's the attorneys that get the money for it. So I just got my TJX one last week and I scanned it so I could laugh at it and have a copy for my archives. But without a private right of action where the statute says this law gives you this much money per violation plus attorney's fees, the only time you're ever going to see those settlements in nuisance class actions and the occasional unicorn that enters into a settlement where somebody makes some money. Without that, you're not going to have any recovery. With a private right of action, lawyer hat, I will crush all your companies because I'll make each violation so expensive and take so much attorney fees from you, you'll have to raise your prices to cover it. Because think about that. What if I could sue every privacy notice that I got saying, we've had a breach, we're sorry, get your free copy of your credit. What if I could sue them for $100, right? What if I could sue every single one of those for $100 in attorney's fees? If I did have private right of action, yeah, it would protect me as a consumer, and I wouldn't have to hope and pray that there would be some class action or government regulator. But the businesses will push back and say, we can't afford all that. We can't have all these class actions because we're going to have all these lawyers out of New York and Chicago and LA suing us for junk claims. They want $500,000 attorney fees, and they'll want a quarter going to each violation. And so there's very strong competing arguments on these two prongs.
Right. And I think if the law passed, the businesses would be very happy because they wouldn't have to comply with all these.
They want that.
But I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that there have been federal breach notification laws proposals for the last decade. None of them have passed.
In fact, we've even stopped doing presentations on them, but for this one, because it had a little traction with all the breaches, because it's just blah, blah, blah. It's like talking about spring preseason baseball. I wonder how the Reds are going to do, right? So it's like, I got other stuff I got to do.
And most recently what happened is that the 47 state attorney generals who do have state breach notification laws recently sent a letter to the leaders of both the houses of Congress and said, you need to preserve the state laws and don't preempt them. Obviously, there's not much they can do because they're not actually in Congress, but that's what the state AGs would like to see. They'd like to retain their ability to enforce their laws. Now, the enforcement actions could come from the FTC. It's mainly going to come from the FTC. If the FTC decides to do that, if the FTC decides not to bring an enforcement action, then the Attorney Generals would be able to.
Who do you think is going to win? Because I see Democrat progressives versus Democrat billionaires. It's an inter-party fight. It's a tough call. The tech industry has a lot of money and a lot of lobbyists. Yes?
So, if you go back one slide,
Sure.
if that passes, is that good for consumers or bad for consumers?
I want to say any state breach notification law that has good enforcement behind it is probably good for the consumer, because the state AGs will retain their ability to bring enforcement actions so long as the FTC doesn't. And FTC, as we talked about earlier, does bring a lot of enforcement actions in this area.
So the Kamala Harris's of the world will still be able to bring their lawsuits.
Right. So what does the law talk about? It defines personal data very broadly. It includes your social security numbers, driver's license, passport, sales and registration numbers, etc. Biometric data, all that is in there. I don't want to spend too much time talking about this. Any combination of any of these elements would be personal data. But there's also the issue of trigger. When do you have to provide a notification to consumers? And the law talks about the compromise of security, confidentiality, or integrity, or loss of computerized data with a reasonable basis to conclude that it has resulted in unauthorized acquisition or access to sensitive personally identifiable information that is unauthorized or in excess of the authorization. So that trigger seems to be a little bit lower in nature than what you see in some of the state breach notification laws, because majority of them, the state breach notification laws, have talk about this issue of risk of harm analysis. And the risk of harm analysis requires substantial or material risk of harm in the state breach notification laws. But in the federal law, it seems to be this reasonable basis to conclude acquisition, right? So it may end up requiring notification to consumers a lot more frequently than the state breach notification laws may.
You'll see some parallels between this and HIPAA's security rule. You can start seeing little. You're like, that sounds like HIPAA.
Right. And it retains notice to media, notice to federal law enforcement, notice to federal credit agencies. But one of the other issues I'd like to talk about is usually when there's a breach, you conduct your risk analysis and you determine whether or not you have triggered any of the state breach notification laws. And that analysis is usually internal. If you conclude that there is not a substantial material risk of harm and there hasn't been a breach, it's been just an incident that doesn't satisfy the definition of a breach under the state law, then you don't need to go to anybody. You just retain that data internally.
A couple of years ago, a litigator called me up and said, our government client has been breached, there's been a security breach, and we want your help in helping us draft a notice that we need to send out. I said, okay, well, I can help you with the notice, but let's talk a little bit more. What got breached? Well, the system got breached. I said, well, did you get any credit card information, any personal identifiers? No, we can document that. I talked to the IT guys, and they said, no, they got into the system, but they didn't get any of the personal information. I said, well, you don't have to send a notice. I said, well, we need to send a notice. I want to do that. I want to do it as a matter of customer service. I said, no, it's a matter of inciting panic. I mean, the issue is helping people protect themselves with their data getting out into the wild. If it didn't actually happen, you don't have to do it. So it's just interesting because some people think, oh, there's a breach, we got to do something. Well, the question is first, what is the breach? And then if there's a risk of harm analysis, right? The question is it personally identifiable? And if you're regulated, you have like another filter for financial institutions or for HIPAA and whatnot. And so you have to go through that. It's not an easy question. A lot of people, especially lawyers that just happen to have that seat in the organization, will get a question from you. And they'll come back with what they think it is rather than what they've gone through because it's a complicated analysis, right? I saw a hand. Yes?
Is there a requirement to preserve evidence?
To preserve evidence. Yeah. Well, forensically, you would want to do that.
Right.
I mean, it's a matter of business record because if you're going to prove the statement in your notice is accurate, you would have to, well, the other thing too is you want to involve law enforcement, so if they're going to prosecute, you want to do that. There's a number of reasons why you would make good business sense and you would need that from an evidentiary perspective. You sure wouldn't want to delete those logs, would you? Yeah. Did I answer your question though? Did I answer your question? Okay.
The risk of harm analysis that would have been kept internal as a result of the state breach notifications laws is now, as a result of this law, if it passes, would become external. You have to provide this analysis, risk analysis that you've done to the Federal Trade Commission to show them, here's what I've done, here's my supporting documentation, here's why I don't believe that there has been a breach, and you have to provide that to the FTC. And if they disagree with you, then you're going to have to do a notification. But this also goes to the issue of, do I have to preserve it? Yes, because your risk analysis is going to be second-guessed, and you want to ensure that the risk analysis that you've done and the supporting documents are there so that the regulator can look at it. This makes the law fundamentally different than any other state breach notification law in terms of how you present your internal risk analysis to a regulator to second guess.
I think we're hitting a note. Yes.
Yeah,
First hand.
how do you know all the events are logged?
It's a fact-driven issue. You have to find out. All you have is what you know, right? So you have a limited period of time to identify what has happened and to go through that analysis. And then if you go through the analysis with the facts that you have and you conclude that no personal data was breached, it just has to be a justifiable business decision. It has to be a reasonable business decision. If you lose control and you cannot attest, right, if there's a gap and you cannot identify where the data was, like for example, if something was lost and then it was found later, until you can document what happened during the lost period, you don't know that it wasn't cloned, stolen, or whatever. So if there's a question, you probably would have to send a notice. Depending on the industry, there's a slightly different calculus because in some situations, some data might not be likely to be used for identity theft. In other cases, it might. If you're going to say what's the general rule, you presume that it's going to cause harm unless you can document why it didn't. And so you're going to see, I think, a harmonization of these principles, right? Health data is starting to look like financial data. It's all valuable, so the rules are slightly starting to change. Everybody's adopting standards that look the same because banks are federal contractors. HHS, everybody's looking at NIST and things like that. So as you go through, you're going to start seeing some harmonization. But basically, I think if you're going to say, put the logs all down and just tell me generally what do I need to do, I think the presumption is that there's harm unless you can prove that there's not, right? So with what records you have, with what forensic data you have, the reasonability of your decision will simply be that if there was an investigation of you, your IT person responsible for that, doing the guts of it, the forensics team, would have to be able to make a statement under oath Here's what happened, here's what our decision was, and was it reasonable? If it's reasonable, then you're good. With the client that called me up, it was pretty simple, and I said, my legal advice depends on the truth of your statement. If you can confirm from an IT perspective, factually, that those databases were not compromised, and you have logs to determine when a person comes in and what they saw and what they didn't. If you can make that statement under oath, then you're good to go. So my answer is fact-driven. So it depends on the data you have. I guess I've had clients that have lost data and then it came back, or they knew that data was accessed, but they could not document what was done with it, or if it was exfiltrated. I don't think unless you know that it's safe, I don't think you can say that it's not been compromised.
And you also have to realize that you know, the calculus about the law and whether or not the definitions within the law are satisfied are I would argue, small part of what you do within a data breach scenario. Because you also have to think about your customers. What kind of customers do you have? Whose data did you lose? Was it a consumer or was it a business? How big of a customer is it? Is it half your business? Would they be ticked off if you told them, in fact, that, you know, you lost some data, but really went to somebody you got it back and it wasn't really a breach? So, how the consumers are going to think about the data breach that happened, how your customers are going to think about the data breach that happened, that factors in. And that becomes, you know, as attorneys talk about it, but it's not in the same sense of, does it satisfy the law? It's a difference.
Yeah, I mean, there's statistical research that indicates that settlements and the cost of legal resolution of something drops exponentially for companies to take the bull by the horns, call the close ones in the customer's favor, send out the notice, and then offer credit monitoring. That kind of diffuses the whole situation. Saw a couple more hands over there if there's something germane here. Okay, good.
And the state regulators aren't standing still either. They're changing some of their laws. The timings are being more constricted. 90 days of notification becoming 30 days of notification. The content of the breach notification is changing. The definition of personal data is expanding to include not what you would consider sensitive personal information in terms of, you know, driver's license numbers, social security numbers, credit card numbers, to include other personal data of what you may consider less sensitive personal data, but it nevertheless becomes part of the state breach notification law. And then the obligation to, once again, notify the media and regulators are increasing as well. The attorney generals in every state want to know when there is a breach, and they want to know as soon as possible. One of the other things that is happening is, and I think this is going to be a trend going forward as well, we talked about the data breach notification laws, and that's how the laws came to be, to inform the consumer that data has been breached so they can protect themselves from fraud. I don't know how you can protect yourself from.
How long has OPM waited to send out their notice yet?
Yeah, they could have waited. It could have been a minute. It could have been 30 days or 90 days. Your fingerprints are gone. Everything you said in a security investigation interview is gone. There's little you can do to protect yourself against the loss of that information, in my mind. But what's happening is we talked about the Massachusetts data breach law. Rhode Island recently passed a law that talks about the requirement to implement a risk-based information security program that contains reasonable security procedures and practices. That's not just data breach notification. That's telling you by law that you must secure somebody's data. And we'll see, I think, more and more of that in the future. And that is going to be the part that we'll talk about data breach. We'll have time for questions, I want to say, at the end, or we'll be around afterwards. So if you have burning questions on data breach security, we're happy to answer them. So, another topic, another cartoon. It seems we're living in the age of owning nothing and subscribing for life, and that's I guess that's how the as a service concept comes around. Blah blah cloud and blah blah platform. So before we can start talking about security in the cloud, I think it's important to talk about why it may be a concern. And this is a study called The Challenges of Cloud Information Governance, a Global Cloud Security Study from the Ponemon Institute from 2014. But you can go back many years about when the word cloud came about, and the results of the survey, in my mind, are going to be very similar. What I want to draw your attention to is right there. Efficiency and cost are the prime drivers of why we want to move our data to the cloud. Security is a distant concern. And your experience may be a little bit different. Security may be more and more of a concern these days, but in my mind, the prime concern is driving.
It's not.
So your concern is very similar. Everybody wants to do this.
It's not any more secure.
Yeah. So moving on, is the security team involved in the data decisions? Rarely or never. Business is moving to cloud. because they want to save money, not because they want to be secure.
Speed.
And you don't know about it. Are they confident that IT knows all cloud computing services in use today? Not confident at all. This goes to the OPM breach that we talked about as well, because there were so many different contractors that were working very hard to modernize some of the systems that had been around for 30-some years, that had been patched since Y2K, to try to bring them into the fold, to make them modern. But so many systems, you don't know where they are. If you don't know where they are, how can you be expected to secure them? Well, I guess you're in that position more often than we just see this in the back end when a data breach happens, and we have to take care of that. So this kind of gives us a background in how security factors into cloud. But another important thing is, how do you select a cloud service provider? Well, contractual negotiation and legal review seems to be important. So at some point, somebody somewhere, there's another question in the study that talks about who gets to look at it. As it turns out, the security people looking at it, those are not the main people who are evaluating the cloud service provider. It's the IT people who are in charge of the budget.
This is a huge issue. A lot of my practice is involved in reviewing contracts for technology providers, and we deal in government vertical, financial services, manufacturing, healthcare, and we see these agreements coming in. We get new providers coming in, we get old providers coming in. What I see from time to time looks like a bill of sale. It's more of a receipt describing the service, describing what they're going to offer, and description of it, and that's it, and a fee charge after that. Well, how about some uptime commitments? What about auditability? What about getting conversion over if we terminate you? What about choice of law? Why does it say limited? Why is the only clause I see, liability is limited to a refund of 3 months prior fees, yet therefore the data breach itself costs $500,000 to resolve? We've worked on data breaches before, and they range legal fees, get up there, right? $100,000 just in legal fees on putting together something that's not contested and not investigated. The contracts that we see right now that involve personal data are abysmal. A lot of them are horrible. But what happens is it's a company that's got a really good, if you take a business, let's say you take a business, right, and it's a pie chart, and you take each slice of the pie, could be HR, could be accounting, could be marketing, could be web hosting, could be tracking leads, and you outsource it. All you have is a management team, and every piece of that pie is outsourced, right? If you take a little slice of that pie, and you outsource that little sliver of 1% to a small cloud-based provider that provides some piece of service, if all the personal data goes through that, I don't care if it's only $750 a month, if it's involving thousands of people's financial records, health records, whatever. Okay, so they're a good value provider, and they can integrate this database with this service. If it goes through there, it's a weak link. It's like having this really strong fort with a little hole cut in with no door, right? So the contract issues are enormous. So I would tell you as you leave, if you see a contract that seems awful, please.
But at the same time, this is a room for an opportunity, right? Something you can do something about. The chances are, you may not be there in the room negotiating the agreements when the business is moving to the cloud. But it'll inevitably happen, and somebody's going to look at the contract and negotiate. Let's hope they know the difference between SOC 1, 2, and 3, and their difference between ISO 9000 and 27001. Because if they don't, you're going to do.
We have a money bidder.
But if client, do you get cloud services? Do you take into consideration the level of service they're getting, whether they're doing software as a service, or platform, or infrastructure as a service?
We do evaluate it very much so, because the business need is obviously important. Our job is to advise them how to get their business objective accomplished. Where the scales tip is just simply the amount of personal data that flows through. I don't really care about their financial data, because they'll have a confidentiality clause, and that's up to them to protect their secret sauce or their code or whatever. We'll put in clauses like that. But where we get into the real troubling issues, where we have to really ramp it up, is if it involves personal data. And we deal with a lot of regulated institutions, where it's a tiny 2-page contract with tons of personal data going through. We'll say, here's what you need to do, and then we'll try to explain logically and in English, here's the law that says you have to do it, and here's the penalties that will apply. Ultimately, we have to step back. We're the lawyers. We can't say, no, you can't do this. The law doesn't say that you can't have a bad contract. The law says if you have a bad contract, here's how you're going to get hit.
Right. In my mind, the slides from Poneman Institute talk about the importance of communicating your needs and your concerns as security people to other people in the organization that make these purchasing decisions, and showing them these nightmare scenarios of the OPM.
And IT is a key partner of ours because we want to legally make your service levels binding. We want you to have the business ability to point to the contract when I'm not around and say, hey, contract says right here's what you're supposed to do, and if not, then this says what we get. Yes?
Yeah, just to make a quick statement on it, I did an interview with a major media sometime, and they wanted to talk about cloud security, and they wanted to know what the biggest issues were around cloud security. And I basically gave them a 30-minute talk on contractual negotiations.
Bless you. Bless you.
The article never ran. Because I said that's where security fails at. Those things need to be part of contractual negotiations and agreements. And I went through a half an hour of things when I was with a Fortune 500 that the security team actually got a link into legal early on, and we actually set in security people into contractual negotiations to make sure that those the security needs, concerns that oversee the overall corporation were part of that contract.
That's fantastic. I started in corporate world before I went into a law firm. I started in corporate, went to Thompson Hine, and started my own practice. And it's pretty cool. The man that started with my firm came directly into a corporate technology practice, and then he stepped in to go into the corporate world for a couple of years and got the benefit of seeing what that environment is like when you don't charge the client. The client has needs. They need to get it done. They're looking at you to get it done, and the biggest challenge is sometimes the person you call in-house. It's like a crapshoot, isn't it? You figure out who gets it and who maybe is better at real estate or maybe better at HR or something like that. But if you have somebody that really appreciates what you do, try to find that person and roll with that, because you need to have it's a working relationship, right? Our job is to get you what you need, but we want to make sure that you know what the vendor isn't promising you. Right? So we help ferret that out. So I think that's great. It's a teamwork issue. And Mehmet had a chance to work with that. I think we talk about that. The biggest punishment you get for being good is the fact your network grows and they start asking you for more and then start asking you on the weekends and at night. Right. Yes?
I heard you highlight personal information. Have you had any experience with export control law?
Export control. One more you made.
Right. But it's another one of the certification or compliance issues that your cloud service provider may or may not be aware of. So if you have the internal expertise in that area, that's something you want to be relying on from your internal attorneys or the cloud service provider. You know, if they have that expertise, they are willing to throw it out there. If you go to
they usually use that as a marketing hub if it's compliant.
Amazon Web Services is all about ITAR and everything else that they're throwing out there. So yeah, that is certainly an issue that you want to think about in the cloud, but. Happy to talk to you afterwards about another issue. But no wonder, talking about contracting puts people to sleep. That's why they're on all these interviews. Because in my mind, contracting in the cloud, contracting and everything else, is about buckets. Buckets of risk, buckets of money, buckets of data. And usually when you're entering into a contract with your cloud service provider, you're going to have your general breach clause. That's going to be the smallest one. It's almost empty. The cloud service provider is going to give you 12 months fees back, paid. The paid fees. If you've been there 12 months paid for 10 of them, you're not getting 2 months. So that's the smallest one, and it just relates to general breaches of the agreement. Then you may have a bigger bucket if you are able to, in fact, negotiate with them. And in that bucket, you may have a little bit more data that may relate to data security breaches, that may relate to notification obligations of the consumer, to the consumer, etc. And then, if you're very lucky, you may get an unlimited bucket that's full of money to cover your biggest risk. But something to highlight is, as attorneys for our clients, we'd like to be able to make these buckets as big as possible for our clients. And the other side, the cloud service provider, would like to make them as small as possible, so in the event something happens, they pay out as little as possible from their pockets. But every client is different, and every business has got different needs. The important thing is to do a risk analysis, to determine where your data is, what kind of data you're providing to the cloud service provider, and what your risks are, and what is the dollar amount that you attach to every single one of those risks. And that will then determine what kind of a limitation of liability clause that you may or may not get from your cloud service provider. I will tell you that unless you are very big, you're going to have a very tough time ensuring that you get unlimited liability for a data breach. And I can tell you with some confidence that for the majority of customers out there, a major technology service provider is likely not going to agree to unlimited liability. Because you may go to a mom and shop technology service and they'll sell you the cloud, and if something happens, they'll just say, bankrupt, sorry, no money. And you may be on your own. But you go to a Fortune 10, or Fortune 15, 20, they have the money to pay you. And if they put it in the contract, unless they litigate in some fashion, they may have to pay you. And they don't want to be in that because those companies are run by people who actually want to continue to have their jobs for the foreseeable future. More often than not, they're not going to be unlimited liability. So it's important to, within your organization, understand how much your data is worth, how you're going to secure it, and how within this agreement you're going to have certain liability provisions.
Just for food for thought on contracts, if you're thinking you're hiring somebody and they're doing your processing for you, you're giving them all your data as an IBM partnering up with Fox to ramp up and whatnot. Unlimited liability. If you think about that, well, if they're doing all the work, why shouldn't they be responsible for everything? There is a compelling argument, if you're a vendor, saying, wait a second, if you want unlimited liability, build it yourself, right? Build this yourself. Go ahead, you can have your own liability and figure it out yourself. What we'll do is we'll scale it up, we'll give you something turnkey. Let's go with something kind of interim. We'll pay you for a bunch, but you still have to self-insure for the difference on that.
Right.
And so it's kind of a shared development. So look at it as shared development costs rather than somebody's not willing to step up and deliver.
Right. And we talked about the main reason of the development of cloud. Businesses are going to the cloud because of the cost. Well, as businesses who are offering the cloud service provider are driving down the cost, they also want to ensure that their liability is down as well. So the cost goes both ways. They want to make sure that they pay as little as possible from their pockets too. But some of the issues go to contracting the cloud and talking about security and privacy and data breach notification. It's important to put in there the right triggers. When do you get notified that a breach has happened? Do you get notified about a confirmed breach? Or do you get notified about a suspected incident?
Or do you want to determine it's a breach, or do you want your vendor to determine it's a breach? Who gets to decide? Because some clauses will say, we'll notify you if there's a breach. I don't know. I want to know if there may be a breach. I'll decide if there's a breach for my client because we may have to send out notices. I don't want a situation where the client's like, oh, I don't think there was a problem. Yeah, there's a gap. I don't care. We won't notify them.
And when do you want to be notified? Within a day? Within 2 days? 10 days? In fact, can any cloud service provider notify you within a day? We can put it in the contract. Realistically, what is our organization's goal in trying to get this done? Importance of certifications. I think as the industry grows and starts coming together in certain certifications, you will see more and more ISO certifications, more SOC 2s and 3s, and the importance of maybe a NIST frameworks, because NIST is also expanding in this area too. Just recently they released the Privacy Risk Management for Information Systems. It's just trying to put together primary vocabulary in discussing these issues. 800-54 is incorporating privacy risks in general, in addition to just security risks. So you're seeing more and more focus on this from the industry, and seeing more certifications. So it's important to ask for those, in my mind, and if you can get them, ask for the audits. But if you're a major cloud service provider, chances are they're probably not going to give you the right to audit their system services data centers anytime, because they may have thousands of customers. And if they allowed every single one of those 1,000 customers to audit their data centers, then the security team would just be inundated with serving customers who want to audit their systems.
Unless there's a breach and you want to carve out, you would have a right in the event there's a potential breach so you can do forensic analysis, but not just a general clause.
Right. So some of these are going to be very tough battles to fight, and it's going to depend on where you stand in your ability to negotiate with your cloud service provider. Another important factor I want to talk about is international data flows. If you ask your cloud service provider, who has access to this data? I know where you're storing it, right? You go to Amazon, you say, in the US or Ireland, wherever, they'll tell you the data center. But who else is taking a look at it? Where are the administrators that are administering this database? Does that result in data transfers to those jurisdictions? I think in the OPM breach, they found out that they had Chinese contractors looking at OPM data. So we'll leave
about subcontractors. Don't just think contractors, right? Contractors have subcontractors. You chase them down the rabbit hole, see what there is. Because for every contractor, there's a subcontractor for something. Business continuity, what do they back up with? Who else has access? things like that.
So it may be important to ask some of these questions and not be too surprised when you realize that your data is being accessed from 20 different jurisdictions by subcontractors.
Yeah, we have clients that segregate it. We'll say we want to keep it right in this one spot.
Right. Yeah, it's stored there, but India, Pakistan, China, and Turkey, they're all going to take a look at it. And I wouldn't be too surprised if that's the way it actually works. But it's important to get those answers. Go ahead.
For contractors, it's typically by the lowest bidder, too.
Right, exactly. It's the issue of cost, once again. Everybody's doing this to reduce costs. And if you expect to go into the cloud because the cost is lower, the cloud service providers are trying to lower their costs, which means instead of having all of your admins in the United States, now they're all out of India. Not that there's anything wrong with being in there, it's just your data is going there too when they take a look at it. So it's important to take a look at all the data security obligations that you provide to them to comply with, because now all this data is going to go there. Is all of that done through secure channels? Do you have two-factor authentication any single time that somebody accesses a web portal or something like that? Those are issues, questions to ask, answers to obtain, and rationalize, and get a specific dollar amount for.
That's an access, we put all kinds of clauses in there for controls. Access proliferation, right? Need to know only kind of things. Token destruction. That's not a big disposal of things. That's not a big key to put in there. There's some interesting clauses we've picked up along the way. Read what you say. Okay, speed to market, scalability, cost savings. That sounds like a tool to get legal compliance to meet. Wait, no. Because you can have a clause, right? You can have a long contract that promises you a lot of functionality, but at the end of the day, what the right hand gives, the left hand can take away. So here, we and our affiliates are not responsible for unauthorized access to your account. So think about that. That's a disclaimer. Here's the keys. Go for a drive, but don't wreck it. And then there's others that are a little bit more, we maintain administrative, physical, and technical safeguards for protection, security, and confidentiality and integrity of your data as described in the documentation. So for regulated companies, you're like, oh, okay, it sounds like Graham Leach. Okay, we're a financial institution, or maybe that sounds HIPAA-esque. So the idea would be here they're agreeing to a contractual standard. So let's take a look at some security breaches. Just a few, and they're interesting. Let me get to my notes here.
And then that previous one, isn't there a huge loophole if the documentation could say we don't do anything?
That's a great question. You were reading your contracts. When you
sign
it, the documentation says Exhibit A, documentation shall be put here. And that's the only contract you have. I have a contract right now that I'm reviewing where it's a cloud service provider providing security monitoring services. There is no service level description. It's a purchase order, and it incorporates another document that's full of blanks and not signed, right? This purchase order is signed. It incorporates a 34-page contract that's just a general purpose contract that you could use to buy real estate or pencils. And then it says we agree to go, and then the services will be provided in accordance with the documentation. And the documentation's like exhibit blank, and there's no exhibit. So, I mean, that is a great question. Just because you have a contract, do the forensic analysis, and where is that exhibit? Oh, it must have never gotten put in there. Well, guess what? You just bought vapor legalware.
But then they also have the clauses that say that we reserve the right to change this at any time without notification.
I'll tell you, I always pushed that when I was at IBM. Because you kind of had to look at it from a security perspective. You always want to be changing your security.
Right.
But what do you do as a customer who sees that? You want to be able to put limits around that because, SSL dies, you want to move to TLS 1 point whatever. You want that to happen. If it stays the same, you're in trouble, right? You want to be able to provide appropriate physical administrative protections. So that maybe, one just quick answer, you could say, well, you're not going to degrade my security. Feel free to change it, so long as it gets better. I'm happy with you making those changes. But you're right, what if it can be changed at will? Is that even contractually feasible? Is that even legal? One where I equal? No.
So let's think about this, right? It seems like the way to get into any of these cloud services, whether you're OPM or whatever, is get that user authentication, right? Find out how people are getting in and get access to it. So LinkedIn, right, 2012, not 3 years ago, about 6 to 10 million hash passwords, but not salted, where you would add random data in a one-way function that hashes a password to prevent dictionary attacks or pre-computed rainbow table attacks. You ever say that? You go to a family get-together and talk about pre-computed rainbow table attacks and just see what people say. But you see, it's the patchwork. It's a password attack. They get passwords that get in. Evernote 2013 stole user information, including names, email addresses, and one-way encrypted passwords. But they were salted and hashed and less susceptible to brute force cracking. iCloud, everybody followed that story about the one writer who had his iCloud account totally wiped by a guy who didn't like him because of a little social engineering calling him customer service.
And I'm sure none of us are about the celebrity photos and everything else too.
And we use two-factor authentication everywhere we can. I've got that on my phone. It's a real hassle, but at least it weighs one more. I like to be able to say that if something happens to us, we're at least using some tools that would reduce the risk of the obvious. And I'm trying to get my wife to start using LastPass, Google Authenticator. She's slowly coming up to speed, but it's very helpful. Dropbox 2012, customer usernames, passwords, and email addresses stolen from an employee account who didn't follow password best practice. Led to two-factor authentication and appointing Condoleezza Rice on the board. And 2014, Interlink. You're going to follow the Interlink story about Dropbox file, when you send a link with a Dropbox file they warned them in 2013 that if you send a link that it stays live, unless you actively disable the link. If you put the link in a browser, it could be shared live to ad networks, and you can track the link and distribute that into the ad networks. So I think the issue is you can build walls around the fort, but just make sure that the soldiers that have keys are trained. I think the issue here, somebody said it's social, right? The issue here is training people on how to identify threats, how to comply with the practices, and reduce the risk of your tokens and your authentication tools being compromised, so that somebody would steal your stuff and use that to just log in and have access to everything. It's almost like World War II. Remember the posters that used to read about loose lips sink ships, kind of a fear, right? So the idea of reducing proliferation of things that can be used against you, you've got to train people, and people have to use them. If they get suspicious emails or things like that, look for weird stuff if you can.
One note I'd like to make is that you'll notice none of these companies are quite the corporate cloud service providers. Are mainly consumer cloud service providers. And I want to say that that's as a result of the hackers going after the low-hanging fruit. And the assumption is, we hope that if we rely on the corporate cloud service providers, that their security is just notch above these, that the low-hanging fruit will continue to be pulled in. Hopefully your corporate data won't be released, but then that's not really confidence building.
In OPM, there's no evidence the information's been used, so the press release goes, right? But boy, now that you have all that information, and you call the bank, right? There's been a problem with my account. Okay, can I have your mother's maiden name? Okay. Can I have your last purchase? Okay. I'd like to make some changes to my account. I'd like to do an online transfer. And I mean, when you have all that information, all that in-wallet type information, and in-wallet plus, what are you going to do with all that? That's going to be smoking down for quite a while.
So how good's your guys' security?
We have a roving sniper team that really looks like plainclothes. And we have Hillary's email server, which is guarded by the. So that's safe.
I think if there's a will, there's a way. And if somebody's going to hack you, they're going to get hacked.
You talk about two-factor, and I've done a lot of assessments of law firms, and I had to do one. It was a social engineering to a law firm, and they had two-factor authentication on everything. So I sent emails out to the site, and I got one back. One of the lawyers was out traveling. So what I did was I went ahead and did some investigation on him and gathered everything about his family, his kids, his mother's maiden name. I literally had everything but his social security number, where he lived, how much money he made, everything, from general sources off the internet. So I called the help desk with the whole ploy that I was going to say, hey, I'm on the road traveling, I have a legal briefing I need to file. I can't get in. My token for two-factor is not working. So I called them up. They picked up the phone. I said who I was, and then I had a legal briefing I needed to file. And they said, sure, Mr. So-and-so, here's a 24-hour token number you use that can be valid.
You get the Kevin Mitnick Award for the day. Here you go. Right? I mean, isn't that the common thing? Is that once you get around customer service, I mean, I've done that. I've called into banks, and as long as you can get information. I deal with what's called, we deal on the consumer side with what's called friendly fraud. The husband who gets a credit card without the wife knowing, the future ex-wife, as he runs up bills. We have the mom stealing the kids' information so that she and her meth habit can get some money, right? I get really interesting calls from people, because, I go, in my social circles, and I try to explain what I do, and they either go, how boring, or, oh, that's cool, you get to just like surf the internet. Yeah, I play Destiny all day, that's my job. and I get 3 Galahorns. So I guess my point is, when I talk about what I do, people don't necessarily grasp it, but in what you're talking about with the idea of maintaining security and things like that, what I like is when people come with real life stories. Hey, I have a problem. Hey, there's something missing in my account. Hey, my account's been accessed, and a friend calls me, and then I get to go and I get to walk through corporate customer service and find out where I went wrong and do the forensics of that chain. That makes it into my story like a document that wasn't done or a permission that was given too quickly and things like that. I represent companies that get friendly fraud all the time. The person calls up and says, I never co-signed for that student loan. And I tell people what I do, and they every now and then a few people get what I do, and they'll say, hey, I have this personal problem. Can you keep it secret, but can you help me? And then I find out what happened. And I've had moms get credit cards in their kids' names. I've had spouses get $25,000 worth of loans in their wife's name so they can pay for their past due child support for the baby they didn't know about. Stuff like that. And so there's all kinds of friendly fraud where people have that. That's going to happen. If you have access to that type of information, you can work your way around it. As I sit there and I wonder, what does the future look like? The only way that you can control what your online image is like and public stuff is like is if you actively go look for it. I mean, Reddit's got some fun things on how to take yourself off of different sites, and there's some threads on there about how to remove yourself from the different tracking sites that do public databases and stuff like that. But it is kind of funny because when you start going through about 15 of those things, which I actually went through, some of them are like, to get out of their network, you have to give them their email address and fax and the driver's license. I'm like, wait, so you don't track me? I have to give you more information. This is perverse, right? So if you start doing stuff like that, I start thinking maybe the future is like, we're in a defense area, right? So when a plane's flying and a missile locks on, it dumps chaff. So it gives fake data so the missile follows the chaff. So I'm sitting there thinking, should I start filling out every customer service card that I have that I'm a woman who rents with 5 kids? That public assistance. One day I'm 5,000, one day I'm 100,000 a year, one day I rent from parents. And I start blowing out all kinds of information that's absolute garbage and I never miss it. Do I put on the back of my wife's SUV 4 girl stickers and 2 dogs and, 1 woman, and then my child is an honor student at St. Brendan's, which they don't go to. I mean, what's the solution? Is the solution chaff and proliferation? Now this is just me thinking, not like a developer, but when you look at how much information is out there, because I deal with governments and public records and things that are out there, people are very terrified once they find out what you used to have to go to the courthouse to find. You can now get online with a search in all kinds of different places.
Yeah,
so it's just interesting. Food for
thought.
thought.
Has actually already done that, and they've been doing that for the last 15 years.
Right,
they
selling
have multiple personas that they've been using, so well developed that if you were doing that type of research, you would be able to find 15 years of history on a non-existent person. A smart person would have done that.
That's like Ben 10 checked into the hotel, and he checked in, what is a 16-year-old named Ben 10?
I did not trust my friends from college, and when my wife and I got married, our hotel reservations were under George and Martha Washington. No questions asked.
But this highlights the importance, once again, of there are no silver bullets.
Yeah.
You just have to stay just above what everyone else is doing. You mentioned the example of just getting a one-time token. Well, there was another security researcher who thought it was just pretty secure, just like I am, having two-factor authentication. Somebody actually called AT&T, said, I can't get into my account. I need you, I'm trying to forward my phone, and it won't do it. You need to do it for me. And he was able to force the customer service provider, the AT&T, to redirect to forward his phone. So he ended up getting all the two-factor authentication codes that were sent from text messages. Got it in. RSA was hacked. Was their source code shared out? Shortly after the RSA hacked, who got hacked? McDonnell Douglas. So all these two-factor authentications, all the security protocols that we use, sooner or later, they will become defunct, and we will need to move something else. And we probably shouldn't be, and I know you probably know this better than I do, but not be dwelling on, if you have two-factor authentication, you do good, great, we're done. But if I can get around it...
Yeah, our issue is more of reducing the obvious, I mean, there's always potential to risk. You call our department, I know who she is. And there's only 4 of us, and so we know who we sound like.
Go ahead.
So, you talk about HIPAA. So I spent 13 years in medical, and I know HIPAA front to back. It's painful. We watch meaningful use go from 1.0 to 2.0, red flag laws, high tech. all of the things that they're trying to do. And at the same time, just in trying to do business as a hospital, now they've got, the EMR system that they had to roll out, IC10. They're spending billions of dollars just trying to keep up with regulation. And you're seeing this not only in that vertical, but financial, auto, and everywhere else, where you look at everything you guys just talked about and all the legalities and the lawsuits and everything that goes along with that. And then at the same token, on the other hand, you're talking about the inevitability of the breach, which everyone in this room, we talk about the inevitability of the breach. And the companies go, you know what? It's going to cost us either way, so let's just do it and hope that we don't. And eventually get to the point where they're willing to put money aside into a savings account for the day of the breach, instead of paying for lawyers and attorneys to go through all this contract negotiation crap. And just, it's hoping, security by divinity. We're just praying and hoping that nothing happens. And so my point in the question is, we've got all these regulations, we've got all these things, we've got everything coming from the federal and the state, but is it actually changing anything? Because
as long as you don't have user behavior, the issue really is user behavior. I mean, if people are not protecting their stuff, and if they're doing stuff that's imprudent and they're opening attachments, they should. A lot of stuff's actually kind of basic. Social engineering, good training for that. It's risk reduction. There are examples in American society of decisions that have been made where they just price the risk in, right? Well, I'll use something simple from my background. Checks. Remember, you used to deposit a check, you write up a signature card, and you have your name on it, and they would compare the signature and your check to the card. After people started using checks, like, forget it, we have a 0.0001 denial rate. The cost of looking at a check is millions. The cost of paying a bad check is thousands. So just blow them all through and we'll catch the back end. And they price that in. You can see thoughts like that applying to security at some point where the idea, and I think the issue of cost and risk is, let's at least go for the big data pools and start doing something, and let's build some big fences and some big pools and put some tight pipes in. And there will be variations, gaps, and problems, and the pipes will crack, right? Think of plumbing, think of water. There are large water tanks that have leaks. There are problems like that. It's just an issue of cost, benefit, and risk analysis. The point is at least start somewhere. And we have clients that don't start.
And I think you've also highlighted why it is that cyber insurance is taken off. People understand that sooner or later this is going to happen to you. What do you do with the risk that you know that even if you do the best you can, you're going to be hit with? You're insured. So I think that's why this is a putting away. But at the same time, not doing anything is not an option, because that is just asking for more trouble.
And companies will. They will do as little as they can. They will do as little as they can.
Yeah.
You irritate me. This is bugging me. This is just ridiculous. So many regulations. Blah, 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 lawyer says instead of blah, 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 cloud. Right? I mean, let's be real here.
Well, and that's the unfortunate reality too, is that, at my last gig, we were looking for a hosted provider, and we did I did the analysis, and I compared companies like SpiderOak and Dropbox, whatever the case may be, and the one thing that I said was, are you encrypting at rest? And out of the 12 providers that I looked just for the storage, only 2 were encrypting at rest. And the HIPAA, as you guys well know, it's under the breach notification. If it's encrypted, there's no breach notification.
Well, but there's not a requirement, is there? It's an if then.
You don't have to encrypt at rest.
Too much money.
You don't have to.
Oh, that's fine. We'll just send a notice.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, they saved a lot of money. I'll save some stamps.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, we'll have a bad article written about us. Boo-hoo. We'll send an email.
But let's face it. If there comes a time when all 12 of the 12 service providers are encrypting, encryption will no longer be an issue, and it will be something else.
Right.
It's we're staying ahead of the curve.
We're tight on time, so we probably should wrap. We had a couple other slides left on time. You want to just take us home on this one? I think we're...
Yeah, I think this is the one. Something good may come out of a data breach someday. So, I think you've all had enough Dilbert cartoons for one day.
So that's sponsored by Delaware Army affiliation.
Thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you.